Good morning, everyone. I hope you are all well rested and ready for this second day. So we are just about to start, and you realize we had a slight revision to the agenda. Some of the presentations that were supposed to have been done yesterday have been brought today. So the first session is going to be covered by Sudhir and Denis. And Sudhir will start us off, just giving us an understanding of the Lima decisions and how that helps us in developing the INDCs. I will help in moderating this session. We will give Sudhir around 20 minutes, and then we will get 5 minutes for our Q&A session. Sudhir, you can start off. Thank you.
We're going to time you.
Okay, and we have a strict time here.
Policy.
Thank you, Suzanne. Good morning once again to everyone. And I must say I'm quite impressed that we are all here by almost 8:30. What I'll do is I'll just touch upon some of the key elements in Lima Decision. This is just to provide a context to the discussions that we'll have during the day today. I will not get into a number of things, but then these will be covered during the course of the day, some by Denis when he presents the INDC template, which is essentially reflecting the decision or the request for information in the INDCs. Just to kick off with the Lima decision, one of the important parts, as Suzanne explained yesterday, was about why all? And I just wanted to put in context that, and if you look at it in terms of projections made by UNEP gap report, in 2020, given the current commitments put forward by the countries, the global emissions would be at the level of about 54 gigatons CO2 equivalent, which needs to go down in 2030 to about 42. So that's a very steep reduction. In a business as usual scenario, it might be in the range of 59 to 56. Now, developed countries will definitely take lead, but it would still require contributions from all. And one of the elements of that contribution is also essentially ensuring that we can achieve these reductions at a minimum cost that is possible, and that's where a role of a number of developing countries comes in terms of identifying what developing countries can do within their own domestic setup, some of it conditional in terms of contingent on availability of means of implementation. And just to kind of provide a better context to that, if you look at the 2050 target, and if one has to stay within the IPCC 40 to 70% reduction below 2010, the global emissions would have to be down to 22 gigaton CO2 equivalent, which is, as you see, about 50% below 1990 emissions. And that essentially, even if we take out 100% reduction from all the developed countries, would still require a steep emission reduction in other parts of the world for us to stay, and this is only to stay within the 2-degree global pathway. So that's the overall context of why all the countries are requested to put up and enhance their contributions to global emissions reduction. The key element in terms of the Lima decision on the INDCs to highlight on this slide was that it is going to be a bottom-up process, so it's completely determined by the countries as to what they can do within their own development context. So it is defined by the countries in context of their own national circumstances and in according to the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability. So that's the framework within which countries are expected to define their own INDCs. So that's very important to understand in this context. Now, in terms of looking at the Lima decision, if one reads through it, the expectation of the Lima decision is that every country will put up in their INDCs a mitigation contribution. So that's something which is expected of all the countries. Second, it also says that those countries who may wish to do so may include also an adaptation component. And as we heard yesterday from Webster, the African group has come to a conclusion that they all would be including an adaptation component. So would be most of the developing countries, as it is an important issue for them. Then there was no discussion on the differentiation. As I mentioned, it is essentially a bottom-up process, and it's for the countries to decide as to how they see their role in contributing towards the overall global emissions reductions. But there was one clarification provided in the Lima decision, which said that the expectations are that are from all the other countries except LDCs and SIDS. In case of LDCs and SIDS, they may, I mean, it's not necessary that they have to communicate it in this fashion, but if they choose, they may present, instead of defined goals, strategies, or plans, or action for undertaking GHG reduction, so that they are onto a low GHG emission development pathways. So that's an important component of the differentiation. So there is no differentiation NX1, non-NX1 explicitly addressed, except for identifying one particular group of countries and recognizing their vulnerabilities to climate change as well as their responsibilities and capabilities. The other two elements which are important in defining INDCs, which again have been highlighted in the Lima decision, is how are these contributions ambitious? And this ambition is defined in the context of achieving the ultimate objective of the convention, and I'll come to that in a minute. And the second important element in that context, because it's a bottom-up process, not a top-down defined process as to what countries should contribute, is a minimum benchmark saying that whatever countries contribute should be a progression beyond the current undertaking. Now, the current undertaking refers to contributions that countries have made up to 2020 as a part of the Cancun agreements, developed countries in terms of economy-wide emission reductions and developing countries in terms of NAMAs that they have put up for addressing mitigation within their own economies. So these two are important elements, and this will be reflected when we talk about the INDC template. Then there were a lot of discussions, and it's important to understand that throughout the year there were, because of the differentiation issue, there could not be any, countries could not read any conclusion as to what the information should be in INDC. So therefore, the decision does not say that it is a mandatory requirement. It's an indicative requirement, but it's an important set of information to be included in INDC. In the sense, yesterday we heard that the Secretariat is going to take a compilation of all the INDCs and also look at it in terms of the adequacy issue. Now, to be able to do that, there needs to be a comparability of information that has been presented. So from that perspective, having this information provides the necessary framework for carrying out that assessment. I would not go into the details, and we will follow up this in the mitigation breakup group, because the focus, as I mentioned, was that each country is expected to include a mitigation contribution. So focus of the information is also primarily on what needs to be included in the mitigation component. So I would not just, I mean, this is there on the screen, so I would not go into it right now. Now, coming back to the 4 elements of the decision, which I thought would be useful to kind of discuss here. One is, what does it mean, contribution? How does the INDC contribution contribute to the ultimate objective of the convention? Now, the ultimate objective of the convention says that the effort should lead towards stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in atmosphere at the level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interferences with climate system. Now, this had never been defined as to what this means or what would be that dangerous level of disturbances. But at Cancun, all the countries agreed that they should aim towards limiting the increase in temperature to 2 degrees and also keep the option open and see if this could be enhanced to reducing following a path which will enable the limiting of temperature increase to below 1.5 degrees. So this is very important. Essentially, this in a way provides a context to the countries in developing their INDCs. As I showed in the last slide, if we are looking at the 2-degree NIPCC report, the recent one, talks about 40 to 70% reduction below 2010 levels by 2050. Now, this is for a global emission reduction. So this is not for one group of countries or other group of countries. It's a global emission reduction that needs to be taken if we want to have a chance of staying below 2 degrees. And even this 40 to 70%, the range only makes it likely, not a certainty that it will stay below 2 degrees. That's very important, again, to understand. So this global goal then defines not only the mitigation contribution, but also would be important in terms of understanding how countries have assessed their adaptation needs in the INDCs. Essentially, as we all know, that the adaptation needs would vary depending on whether one is assuming that the increase in temperature would be limited to 2 degrees or to 1.5 degrees, because the adaptation needs are going to be much more higher if one is looking at 1.5 degrees. And this also it has to be a consistency between what the countries are then providing as a context in terms to their mitigation contribution. Because it would be a little inconsistent to say that, okay, our global mitigation contributions are aligned with 2 degrees, whereas our adaptation needs are aligned with 1.5 degrees. So it provides a context to both adaptation and mitigation. Now, in terms of how countries have used in the INDCs which have been submitted, some have put it in terms of the global temperature goal target. Some of them have expressed it as a global emission pathway. Some possibly might also, I mean, this is based on what I have been hearing, define it in terms of a global carbon budget and how they see that part of global carbon budget they would be requiring and they would be using in context of the country's own fair and equitable share. So this context is also then again linked to defining how as country assess that what its fair contribution is going to be for mitigation, and how does it see that it is equitable in context of the principle of CBDR and RC. So that's the context which INDCs should provide, and that basically then makes others understand that where the country is positioning itself in terms of the contribution that it makes, both for mitigation and adaptation. The second aspect which is there in the INDCs, which needs to be understood, and the presenters yesterday, especially Chris from Ricardo, had talked about it quite a bit, is what is the planning process. Now, the idea of highlighting this planning process, it should be explaining, not expelling, that how is INDCs nationally owned? Ultimately, this is a bottom-up process. Countries, we do not know yet what the status of these INDCs would be in the negotiations. I'll touch upon that in a minute. But it has to be, if those efforts have to translate into actions and to be achieved, the INDC contributions have to be nationally owned. Now, what does that mean in terms of being nationally owned? Some of the elements which have come up in the explanation which are provided that in the INDC submitted is how is it connected to the sustainable development strategies within country. Essentially, this provides the strongest anchor saying in countries saying that, okay, what we are going to do is for our sustainable development are these actions, and within that framework, where are the opportunities or where are the activities that we think could help us also move towards a low emission pathway. And since development strategies have a larger buy-in, that provides an anchoring to the INDC contribution as well. The second context of the planning process is how have countries gone about defining for themselves what their climate change strategies or what their climate change or vision to address climate change is within countries. The third element is what are the plans, policies, and other aspects. So China yesterday came out with their INDC, which is on the website now. So did South Korea. So there are 2 more INDCs. The Chinese INDC is quite interesting to read because it doesn't stop at just explaining that this is what we are going to do in terms of our goal, but it then further goes on in defining that what are the plans and policies they are thinking of putting in place, because that, to an extent, concretizes the goal in terms of specific actions. It might not be very highly specific, but it provides an indication of what are the key areas which a country would be addressing within their own development and climate change vision perspective. The second element, which is important in the process of explaining the context, is the institutional arrangement. And we talked about, and I mean, in the presentations that were made in the morning by all the participants here, we talked about the institutional setup, because most of the countries are not at a stage where they're just started to think. They actually have already started integrating climate change within their own development planning processes. So it is reflecting that, and also reflecting that how countries are planning to strengthen that, because an institutional framework is important to underpin the implementational plan. Without that, it becomes challenging within countries. It also is important to context, as it provides a vision or a view into how countries have gone about in consulting within the government structures, and that means not only at the central government level with respect to the key ministries, but how local governments at the provincial level or the city level have been involved, because ultimately at the end of the day, the implementation of these actions is going to be lying with these actors, these important actors. The third element of that process is stakeholder involvement, and we talked about that yesterday as well, because there are going to be implications. Let us be honest about it, that it is not going to be a free ride. There are going to be changes, there are going to be winners, and there are going to be losers. And it is important that for a strong buy-in within the country, that different stakeholders are involved and they understand what it would mean for them and what they would like to also see, because these are the actors which are actually affected by climate change. So it's important to include them. The next element which is important in this planning process context is the political process of approval, or rather I would put it the other way around, the political backing of developing INDC. And this is the most important element. Essentially, at the end of the day, INDCs are going to be a country's submission to an international forum. So it has to have a political endorsement for that contribution to come up. And unless and until at the very beginning of this process there is a strong political support, it would be very challenging to move this process forward. And I think that's the most important element to look forward. Now, in some of the cases, countries have also talked about implementational tools as to how they plan to implement some of the contributions they have action. Now, some countries might not be at a stage where they can explain in details, but some others might be in position to do so, but it also provides a view into how countries plan to translate a goal or a target into action. So these are some of the important elements that need to be included that would help understand other countries what is the vision that a country has in terms of its INDC contributions. I listed some examples here how different countries have highlighted this aspect. So Ethiopia has talked about anchoring their contribution within National Development Plan and as well as their climate resilient economy vision and strategy. And they highlight that this was developed through a very inclusive and a participatory process. So that's the basis of their defining what their mitigation and adaptation contribution are going to be. Morocco in its INDC includes a set of laws, strategies, and national action plans which underpin the actions that they have identified for mitigation and adaptation they would be undertaking. So I'll not read through the list, but if you look at these INDCs, they provide a good glimpse. I mean, they're not covering all the elements that I talked about, but they're covering some of the elements in that particular process. The idea is to provide confidence to other partners in this journey that everyone is making their best effort in moving forward. Now, the other question that I would like to touch upon here is these questions are something which came up in the last workshop based on questions raised by your colleagues who were in the first workshop, is the concern about how would the adaptation component in INDC be treated. This is an optional contribution. Countries may choose to do so. Most of the developing countries have indicated that they would do so. But there were some questions about what would be the nature of this adaptation contribution. Will it be legally binding national contribution? And what would that mean in terms of its implementation in the countries? Now, it's very important to understand that INDCs in itself do not define whether they are going to be legally binding, nationally legally binding, or otherwise. It depends on the context that is provided by the agreement which all the countries will reach in Paris. And what is the language which is included. Now, if one looks at the options which are there within the adaptation, sorry, let me step back a little bit. Now, one could have both the components, INDC mitigation and adaptation, but depending on the language, it could be that one part is legally binding and the other part is more an encouragement to countries to contribute and to take measures to start addressing adaptation. Now, in the language which is there in the present text, it ranges from different options. It talks about country collectively cooperating to address adaptations, to countries shall take adaptation action. Now, it is making it the onus on the countries or grouping of countries to address this particular issues. The second element which is there as a part of the option is that countries should make effort to integrate adaptation action in development planning. So it's more pointing towards how to go about making sure that these adaptation actions are taken and are addressed at a country level, because we all realize that this is something which is necessary. This is not something that we can wish away at this stage, given the changes which are already occurring. Now, in the adaptation, most of the countries would also indicate what are the means of implementation they would require. And it is quite likely that in the negotiation, there might be an agreement on finance being a legally binding commitment. It might not define in terms of what each country has to contribute. It might be at an overall level. Or it could also be that it is, again, something which is encouraged of developed countries to provide that particular support. So that context becomes then important on what would be the implication of what countries have highlighted within their adaptation component. Now, the third element which is important is how would adaptation get treated in the transparency, because that's an important element of any legally binding component. For the time being, the transparency focuses more on the process of finance and mitigation than on the adaptation. But at the same time, it is still important because as country, as a national document, INDC would become a national, at least voluntary goal to achieve those adaptations. And within that context, having a transparency at a country level becomes important both towards its own stakeholders in explaining how government is actually going about addressing adaptation, but also it is something which helps in creating that confidence in other countries that actually the resources they have been provided are translating into changes on the ground. And to that extent, it is important, though it might not be talked about in the context in negotiations right now, it is important to focus on the transparency aspect, how the monitoring and reporting of adaptation actions would take place. So all in all, at this stage, it is very open, but most likely adaptation actions are going to be more of a national onus to implement rather than an internationally enforced is the word that I want to use, in terms that countries have to take, and therefore what they have promised has to be delivered in that context. But in terms of what is the adaptation actions which have been implemented using means of implementation, that definitely would have a certain element of clear reporting as to how the resources have been used. But the actions, to the extent that countries take using their own contributions, would be up to the countries to implement and translate into actions. How am I doing? I'm really running slow. Okay. INDCs to national commitment, I would not go into details, but we can discuss this in the sidelines. At this stage, it is not yet finalized that how INDCs would translate into national commitments. It is still intended nationally determined contribution. There are negotiations going on that what would be the process of anchoring these INDCs in a legal context or in an agreement context. Let me not use the word legal. But there seems to be a very high likelihood that there would be a certain set of process which would be followed, which will allow countries to revisit their INDCs in context of the agreement which takes place at Paris, also in context of the overall requirement of a global effort to stay within the ultimate objective of the convention. Now, that particular process could also be in various ways, and ranging from a very legal context, like in Kyoto Protocol, where in the annexes, countries listed, all the contributions were listed by countries saying that, okay, these countries are going to undertake this. Or it could be on the other extreme in terms of an INF document, like in Cancun, where there was no, INF document is purely an informational document in the UNFCCC context. It makes it very voluntary on the countries, and it essentially means that this is what the countries have proposed to do so. But it does not imply that countries are required to do so. So it could range from that, and it depends on what exactly would be the nature of the agreement. Plus, it is also quite likely, because the focus is going to be on first having an agreement and coming out with a new protocol or any other instrument that might be decided by the countries. But to anchor then the INDCs within this particular agreement, one might see a process following, because ultimately these are going to be implemented post-2020. Okay. In terms of the legal context, just I'll stop here with this. There are two things that are important to look at. It is what is the legal nature, but it is also important to look at the compliance mechanism, because the compliance mechanism is which translates the legal nature into an enforceable act. But for the time being, most of the compliance mechanism which is being talked about is of a facilitative review. So it is not of a punitive nature that if countries do not achieve that, they would be enforced to do so either through a penalty or some other action, but it is more of a facilitative nature. And then there is also discussion about differentiation within the compliance mechanism or the transparency issues, where developed countries and developing countries are treated in a different context. For example, some of the options talk about that in case of developing countries, the compliance would be a facilitative mechanism to identify what are the challenges countries are facing and how they can be helped to actually move forward to achieve their contributions. I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sudhir, for that overview and giving us a very interesting and detailed interpretation of what the Lima decisions mean in our in the INDC preparation. I wouldn't want us to go into asking questions. If you have any questions, kindly just note it down. Then after we have the second presenter, we will then ask the questions to both speakers, if that is okay with all of you. So allow me to invite the second speaker, Denis, to introduce us to the INDC template. Thank you.
So good morning. So I have a short presentation. They asked me to reduce it to 10-15 minutes. So as Sudhir has mentioned, for the purpose of the project, we have developed a template proposal for INDC for a submission to UNFCCC. So note that, as I just mentioned, it's a proposal. So of course the structure and the content of this template can be modified according to the kind of information that each of your country would like to submit to a UNFCCC. However, I think I have to highlight that we think we have discussed, of course, this template, and we think that this is the, I would say, right information that could be submitted to UNFCCC to well, give most credibility to your INDC. Okay. This template, of course, has been developed taking into account the Lima decisions that Sudhir has just described, and also has taken into account the different INDC which have already been submitted to UNFCCC. So I will describe you just, well, briefly and quickly the content of this INDC. So note that here I will only focus on the structure, so on the big section of the template. So the purpose of my presentation is not to explain you how to develop or get the detailed information which should be included in each section, because these topics will be discussed during the rest of the day in the adaptation and mitigation stream, okay? So the idea is to get, at the end of the presentation, your feedback on the global structure and global content of the template. So the template, yes, also an important point that actually, and I hope that most of you have received it, we have sent this template proposal in the package sent to the countries, I think, beginning of last week. So I hope that most of you have received it and maybe had already the opportunity to have a look on it. So the template, actually, I have only 3 slides. Has I would say, has the format of a table and has 3 main sections. So the first section is about the description of the national context. The second section is about the adaptation component of the INDC, and the last one is on, of course, mitigation component. So we have included an adaptation component, and actually, as you see, we put it before the mitigation component for the following reason. So, as Sudhir has mentioned, although the, I would say, international political process focus on the mitigation component in INDC, we believe that for most of your countries, maybe all of your countries, adaptation, of course, is the highest priority, is a higher priority than mitigation by itself. So we think that it may be politically correct, I would say, for you to put or to present the adaptation component before the mitigation component. So coming back to the first, here, to the first section. So the first section is, the objective of the first section is to describe the national context in which the INDC will be or is developed and will be implemented. So this first section, this first part, is about national development goals and priorities and a climate change context. So the objective here is to describe briefly, first, I would say, the social, economic, and environmental context, and challenges in your countries, and to describe also the sustainable development goals and priorities in your countries, and of course relevant for the INDC. So regarding climate change, so we think that the best would be to describe, I would say, give a brief description of any climate change strategy, national strategy that you may have in the country, or at least to describe how the climate change issue topic is included in your national development documents. also, in these sections, you may describe any, or give a brief overview of any mitigation strategy that you may have at national level. So, for example, if your country has already developed a low carbon development strategy, and of course, also any national adaptation strategy that you may have, or describe at least how adaptation is included in your national strategy and sectorial strategy. So actually, this kind of information, it's, I think, not new for you, because it's the kind of information which is usually described in the national communication or in the bourse. Okay, so I think that most of you, or all of you, will be familiar with this kind of information. So the next section is about the adaptation component of the INDC. And for this, so the adaptation group in our center has developed, I would say, this table. And as I was saying, you will have the opportunity to discuss with them in the adaptation stream the way to develop the information to be included in each of these 7 points. The first point is, and the second point, about rationale and process for developing NDC on adaptation, and the second one, summary of climate change trends, impact, and vulnerabilities, should describe actually the current, well, in the first one, the current situation of your country in terms of vulnerability. And most specifically, maybe for at least the key sector which are affected by climate change. So the second point is then more projections on how the different sector may be affected by, well, in terms of vulnerability in regards to these 2 degrees. Okay. So the third point is about reporting on long-term and mid-term adaptation vision, goals, and targets. So regarding the vision, it's the long-term perspective that your country may have in regards, well, on adaptation in regards to human development. And for this, well, I don't have the text here, but if you refer to the Moroccan, actually INDC, Morocco has defined a clear vision of the country in its adaptation component. About the goals, the objective here, so the purpose is to describe the adaptation goals at sectoral level, usually, that the country may have. And for example, in the different INDC already published, countries, well, according to the countries, for example, have expressed some goals in terms of amount of savings irrigation water, in terms of measures to prevent soil erosion, or, for example, also in terms of access to drinking water to the population. Okay, so this is for a third point. 5 minutes? Okay. So a 4th point is about a description of the existing plans and programs, policy and strategies. So I think this is not new. Also, I think that, for example, most of your country, I guess, have NAPA, and this is also the kind of information you find there. So regarding then, in relation with the point 4, so the point 5 will describe the gaps and barriers that the country may have to reach actually the adaptation goals described in point 3, or to implement the adaptation plans or a strategy described in point 4. Okay. And I know that adaptation, the stream, has a specific presentation on these aspects. Then, of course, in regards to point 5, then you may describe the needs to address actually this barrier, and this may be the capacity building needs in terms of technology, and of course needs in terms of finance. And finally, in point 7, you can include a description of any monitoring system which could already be in place or that you would like to develop to monitor, I would say, the adaptation component of your INDC. So this is briefly the structure for the adaptation component. For the mitigation component, in 3 minutes, so the first point, I think this mitigation component, it's easier because I think that usually countries have better clarity on what mitigation should be, of course, in the INDC. So the first point about the time frame, it's the year target. And usually, of course, country will include 2030, so to allow comparability at the end, but may include intermediary year, like 2020 or 2025. The type of contribution is the way that your mitigation target is expressed. If it's a GHG target, a non-GHG target, economy-wide target, sectoral target, on this, actually, Sudhir will do a presentation to show you what could be the different way to express the contribution. For example, in the case of Morocco, they have expressed the emission reductions compared to a business as usual scenario by 2030. So the third point is the self-contribution targets, the description of the what could be the self-contribution targets and the targets with support. So a target that your country may define in the first case, so the unconditional target, so without any international support, and the second one, the conditional target, so with international support. And for example, again, referring to the Moroccan INDC, in the first case, Morocco has described a list of 10 key actions which would be implemented under the unconditional target, and has described then or listed 52 mitigation actions which may be implemented with international support. Okay. So the point 4 is the quantification of the GHG reductions. So of course, in terms of megaton CO2 equivalent. Then 5 and 6, the sector and gases which are covered by your INDC. Point 7, accounting methodologies. So this refer usually when actually you take the existing INDC to the IPCC guidelines, for example, to develop or to develop the inventories, or the GWP, or any, or at least also describe the forestry or other land use activity which have been taken into consideration in the calculation of your INDC. Finally, point 8 is about equitable and adequate. So I would say how a description of how your INDC is, I would say, fair compared to the global mitigation effort, and compared to also what your country could actually achieve in terms of mitigation. And I think Sudhir has explained this concept also briefly. And finally, point 9, well, it's a description of institutional arrangement for the implementation of the INDC, or actions included in your INDC. And finally, the means of implementation, again, in terms of finance, technology, and capacity development. And for example, for this last point again, in the American INDC, so they have, in relation with the point 3, described that the overall investments, for example, to implement the whole, well, the conditional target is 45 billion USD. Among this amount, 35 billion are conditional. So again, you can express these needs, of course, in relation to the conditional and unconditional targets defined in your INDC. So this was quickly a brief description of a template that we propose. Again, there is no obligation to use, of course, this exact template. Okay, just to be sure that this is understood by you. So I thank you, and so we are open for questions and suggestions and comments, of course, on the template. Thank you.
Thank you, Denis, for your very fast presentation and quick. So we are combining questions both for Sudhir's and Denis' presentation. And if any of you had already had a look at the template and you have some feedback that you had already prepared, you can also share that with us. We are hoping to have this Q&A session for a maximum of 7 minutes, so that at least by past we move on to the next speakers. Yeah, so we had one question from Philippines, that's noted. Now it's Rwanda and then PNG. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Denis, for the clear presentation. I believe this is a good guidance for us all. Like we have used other templates before in the other UN frameworks. I would suggest that this you also propose you give an idea of how big a section would be in terms of number of pages, because as you know, people can put as much as information, you might end up getting like a report of 500 pages. Yeah. So my suggestion would be that you give an idea of what size a particular section would be. Thank you.
Thank you, Shido. From your presentation, just out of curiosity, specifically for INDC, we do have existing projects like nationally appropriate mitigation action projects that we are currently undertaking, as well as clean development mechanism projects in our country. And then when we talk about INDC, are there any distinction between these 3 different projects? And there's a little bit of confusion there in how we should go about aligning them, because when you talk about INDC, it's like what from my observation from the presentation yesterday, I've come to reckon that then we need to have a very good and a solid greenhouse gas inventory in place in order to ensure that we develop a proper baseline for this INDC project, because without it, we cannot know how much emission we are producing from the respective sectors, and also how much we're gonna reduce. So baseline is a very important component in preparing the INDC, and I'm concerned that if we only have, it's a challenge for, because we are developing nations here, it's a challenge to all of us. If we can give an adequate reflection of how much greenhouse gas emission that we are producing in our country from the respective sectors. If then and only we can come up with a very good baseline study so that we can know how much our country is reducing, and then we can plan ahead to come up with aligning projects, CDM projects to address this one. But then my question is, can you distinguish between mitigation, like NAMA and CDM and INDC, so that we know where we are, so that we can prioritize our INDCs. That's my first question. My second question is that in terms of reporting, should we come up with a different reporting? Do we have a reporting structure for INDC? Or is it similar to biannual update report and national communication? That is another question that I want to know. So sorry if you other countries, if you know already, I'm sorry about that, but from Papua New Guinea. And the third one is from the presentation that the other speakers just presented. Do we have a standard INDC template to follow? Like from comparing with the Mexico template, the African template, and then now UNEP template. So like, which one is the most appropriate one that we need to follow? We are developing countries. You are the ones who are telling us to come up with all sorts of, so we are not completing our numbers and all this, and then you are giving us a lot of work, but anyway. But which one is the appropriate template that we need to follow? Is it from you, or are we going to follow the Mexico way or the African way? Or yep. So I think these are the three questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. So you'll allow me to close the. Oh.
Maybe we take these answers and then
Later. Yeah.
no,
Okay, let me just allow the presenters to address the three questions, and then we'll see if we'll have enough time for another session. Okay.
Yeah, I'll be relatively brief, but we can take this up further discussions later on. Responding to what Albert mentioned in terms of how does adaptation, especially it is going to be expressed in terms of means of implementation that countries would require, become legally binding on the developed countries in terms of providing the means of implementation for adaptation. As I mentioned, INDC is just a template in terms of reporting what the countries would like to do and what are the conditions under which they would be able to do these actions. What would be relevant is in terms of looking at the agreement, and in the agreement, how is different components reflected, like what is the agreement on adaptation, what are the responsibilities they are defined for adaptation for different countries, especially in terms of who provides the finance and how the finance would be provided. So it becoming legally binding for developed countries would then again depend on this reflection within the adaptation section first, and second in terms of in the finance section. Because right now in the finance section, the way options have developed, there is no specific target for the developed countries to provide resources, but it is more generic in terms of overall goal of what level of finance should be provided and who would have the responsibility of providing that finance, plus what would be the channels through which this finance will be provided. So it might not reflect in terms of individual countries' responsibility of providing this finance, but it might reflect more a collective responsibility of addressing the needs for adaptation. So the channel essentially lies in how the text is agreed within these two sections for means of implementation for adaptation. In terms of differentiating between CDM, NAMA, and INDCs, what I would say is that INDCs essentially define a collective or an overall goal that countries put on their mitigation efforts. Since we are talking of CDM and NAMAs, I would restrict it to mitigation. Whereas the CDM or NAMAs provide an implementational tool of how to translate that goal into actions. So they are not something exclusive that if one does CDM, one will not submit INDC, or if one does INDC, you cannot do CDM or implement NAMAs. because INDCs, as mentioned by Chris yesterday, could also be expressed in terms of a number of NAMAs that country would like to express. The key difference would be in INDCs, the expectation is that countries would also then present that what would collectively implementation of the CDM and NAMA projects lead to GHG reduction. And that becomes an overall goal that the countries might put forward in terms of their in targets. I think on the template, I'll leave it to Denis.
Yes. Well, so about the length first, of course, we could include some suggestions. The idea of the NDC is to be, I would say, a short document. So as it has been mentioned yesterday by the CDKN speaker, so the current INDC have between, I think, 4 pages and 15 pages. The longest one is the American one. I particularly like actually the American INDC, even if it's the longest, because I think it's quite written and quite clear. So I think it's also a good reference for French-speaking countries. Know the length, of course, so the amount of information included in your INDC, I think it's also a political decision. But as the person from CDKN has mentioned yesterday, so the idea is not to give 20 pages description of your national context. So if you would like to provide more information about general information on your country, so the best is to include some references or a link in the INDC itself. So regarding now the which template to choose, so first, as I think you know, so there is no formal template approved at international level. So again, the structure and the content of each INDC will be decisions which should be taken in each country, so based on a political decision, of course. Usually the content of the mitigation components is more or less clear. When you compare different INDC, actually the 10 points that we have here are the 10 points, more or less. Well, it can be, the structure can be a bit different, but are the 10 points usually covered in each INDC. Then, of course, the level of information or the way, for example, that the contribution is expressed can be different from one country to another country. But so this mitigation components, it's more or less the same for all the country. So regarding the adaptation components, when you look at the INDC, which have been published so far, almost all these INDC include an adaptation components in a very general way. So usually the adaptation components has a 1 to 2 pages described as a general overview of what is the vulnerability, current and future, of the country in regards to climate change. So we think that it's in your interest to provide, of course, maybe a more detailed information on adaptation. Of course, this will depend again of political decision in your country and also of the information that you may have already available on these aspects. For example, well, I'm not adaptation expert, but I think that to calculate the financial impacts of the climate change on your sector, I think it's quite a tricky stuff in adaptation. So if you have such kind already of information already available, I think it's worth to include this information in the document. If you don't have it, 1 month is quite short, of course, to do it. Yeah, so I think I will leave it here. I think, yes, that I like numbers, so I think that INDC, it's a good opportunity to put number for mitigation and adaptation. So I think if you have numbers, so put numbers.